All right, so what we're diving into today isn't some kind of instruction manual for being human. Think of it more like a collection of field notes, fragments from one person's experience trying to figure out this whole life thing. It's really a story about the search for a place to land in a pretty confusing world, and, what happens when the map you've been given just doesn't match the road you're on. So this quote, it's from this group the narrator of our story calls the perspective specialists, kind of like these alien meta-observers that just showed up in his journals one day. And this line, it totally sets the stage for everything we're about to explore. It frames this whole story as one of an observer, someone who's always been on the outside, looking in, just trying to make sense of it all.
You know that feeling of being a kid and pressing your face against the glass, watching everyone else's life happen? That was him. From day one, it felt like everyone else got the rule book, but his copy was missing. The world was confusing, people were inconsistent, and he just never knew where he was supposed to fit. So he did the only thing he could do. He watched, and he wondered, and he wandered.
To give you an idea of what that wandering looked like, think about this number. 12 different schools in 13 years. Just let that sink in. Especially after his parents' divorce, his childhood was like being a pinball, constantly bouncing from one place to the next, never really settling. There was no home base, just motion.
And all that constant moving, it creates something deep inside you, a kind of ache, a persistent ache for belonging. When you've never really landed anywhere, the idea of a hometown, of a tribe, of a place where you're truly known, well, that becomes this huge driving force. It's a fundamental need, right? To finally belong.
So what do you do when your whole life has been defined by instability? How do you fix that? Well, for our observer, the answer was to stop waiting for stability and to start building it himself. He decided, fine, if the world won't hold still for me, I'm going to build my own world, a fortress of certainty, a place that is unshakable.
And here's basically the blueprint he used. After all those pinball years, he moved in with his grandmother. Her world was stable, it was predictable. Then he chose a religious college, not really for the education, but because it promised answers, a solid framework. He went all in on his faith, convinced it was the only thing that could fix the parts of himself he didn't like. And finally, he married his best friend Laverne, and they built this life together centered on a clear shared mission. It was safe, it was structured, it was his fortress.
But here come those perspective specialists again, dropping this little truth bomb. He mistook alignment for safety. See, he thought he was safe because he was following all the rules, because everything lined up perfectly with this rigid system he'd chosen. But what he was really doing was just building walls to lock away the tough questions and ultimately the truest parts of himself.
This brings us to the core conflict, which he describes in this brilliant way as a giant internal jigsaw puzzle. He was constantly sorting through his own thoughts, feelings, and memories, trying to force them all to fit into one single, neat picture of who he was supposed to be. So he had two piles of puzzle pieces. First, you have the sky pieces. This was the life he was building. His faith, his marriage, his identity as a good man. This was everything he wanted to be true. But then, there was this other pile. The pieces that just didn't seem to fit anywhere. And deep down, he knew they weren't sky pieces at all. They were water pieces.
And this, right here, is the heart of the struggle. He was so desperate for those confusing, unsettling water pieces to belong in the beautiful sky he was creating. And they kind of looked like they could fit, right? They had reflections of the sky in them, so he just kept trying to jam them into place, pretending they belonged, all while this quiet war was raging inside him.
He hits this really low point, feeling like a total imposter in his own skin, and he starts writing a screenplay. It's about a guy who's planning to just disappear. But before he does, he meticulously stages his entire house so people will only remember the perfect, lovable version of him. It was a massive cry for help, really. A last-ditch effort to control the narrative because he could feel his own was about to shatter into a million pieces. The more perfect his fortress looked on the outside, the more terrified he was of it all crumbling down. So he doubled down, again and again, trying to hold it all together. But that internal conflict just got louder and louder, which leads us to the big, inevitable question: what happens when the pieces just refuse to fit anymore? The breaking point wasn't some big, dramatic event. It was more like an unearthing. It was the moment a truth that he'd buried for decades finally clawed its way to the surface. He calls it a damned old itch, something he could no longer scratch, ignore, or pray away. And then, a man named Michael came into his life. Now, this wasn't about romance. They were both married, both committed to the lives they had.
this was about something way more fundamental. It was about recognition. After hours and hours of just honest conversation, for the very first time in his life, he felt completely and totally seen.
And something pretty incredible happened. By seeing the goodness and the worthiness in his friend Michael, he was finally able to turn that same empathy toward himself. He realized that all those parts he'd spent his entire life trying to fix or erase, they weren't flaws. He wasn't broken.
That damned old itch, it wasn't a flaw, it was his truth. And that realization brought this incredible sense of clarity, but also some absolutely terrifying consequences. Because it meant that the fortress, the life he had so carefully built, his marriage, his ministry, his whole identity, it couldn't stand. The puzzle had to come apart.
So begins the final chapter of this journey, the long, hard, intentional work of rebuilding a life from the ground up. But this time, there was no borrowed blueprint. This time, the foundation was going to be authenticity.
The very first step was unlearning. He had to let go of that rigid, black-and-white rulebook he'd been clinging to for safety, and he replaced it with a much simpler, much more human compass. Just do for others what you wish had been done for you. Listen, care, show up. That's it.
And here's the thing. The pillars he built his new life on weren't some brand new discovery. They were the very things that had kept him going even when he was inside the fortress. But now, the difference was he was choosing them intentionally. He was consciously committing to community, to creativity, and to reflection. These became his new guiding principles.
Years later, he and Michael bought a house together. And this place, it was a wreck. I mean, abandoned, trashed, holes in the walls, a total disaster. But they saw its potential. And room by room, they didn't tear it down, they restored it. They turned it into this place of joy and safety that they called the Laugh House. And isn't that just the perfect metaphor for rebuilding a life?
Looking back on all of this, he realized something profound about legacy. It isn't about the grand gestures, the perfect stories, or the big sermons. It's built in the small, quiet, honest things you leave behind, like the old reels of his grandfather's sermons he found on a shelf. It's the choice to just record a thought, to tell your messy, layered truth, to leave a little something for the next person walking the path. And that, of course, brings the whole story right back to us. These field notes, they aren't just about one guy's journey. They're an invitation for us to look at our own. What parts of your story need to be told? What do you wish someone had recorded for you to find? And maybe most importantly, what honest, imperfect, and beautiful reel are you leaving on the shelf for someone else?